the foundation of mind. The human brain uses about 20% of the body's energy, even though it makes up only 2% of its weight, which shows that consciousness was a very costly evolutionary investment. This creates a puzzle. Why would natural selection spend so much biological energy just so we could have subjective experience? The explanation lies in the power of prediction. Small creatures simply reacted. Humans began to imagine. Instead of only responding to what was happening right in front of them, early humans started rehearsing situations, designing tools, and picturing outcomes before putting themselves in danger. This shift happened because of three connected changes. First, social groups became so complex that basic reflexes were no longer enough. Second, language provided a symbolic framework for storing and sharing abstract ideas. Third, a brain capable of imagining and internally rehearsing situations made learning faster without life-threatening mistakes. Together, these changes transformed thinking into a tool for seeing ahead. Imagine a hunter who can picture a stalking route and the coming weather before leaving camp. That mental rehearsal lowers danger and increases success. Neuroscience backs this up with research on the default mode network and predictive coding, systems that run internal simulations when we rest or sleep. Anthropology shows more advanced tools and collaborative hunting appearing as these mental skills grew. Philosophically, imagination changed what it means to act. Minds became capable of shaping worlds, not just reacting to them. This shift still affects modern life. It explains why humans fear imagined dangers as much as real ones, why stories shape shared beliefs, why planning feels satisfying. It suggests a mental method for taking action. Treat imagined scenarios as practice fields, not final judgments. Build multiple possible futures in your mind. Compare them with reality. Favor models that save energy and reduce unwanted surprises. Use this way of thinking to create better habits and stronger decisions. In short, consciousness didn't evolve just for awareness, it evolved for better prediction. Its value is not in the experience itself, but in how accurately and efficiently those mental simulations guide real actions. From instinct to intellect. The first human thought was neither pure reflex nor pure logic. It was a quick guess formed by survival instincts and repeated experiences. From biology, we inherit fast responses, reflexes, and conditioned patterns that protect us instantly. From culture, we inherit symbols and rules that slow down our thinking just enough to allow planning and abstraction. The mind develops by weaving these layers together. Stage 1. Embodied routines. Babies learn by moving and sensing. Their sensory motor loops form dependable expectations. Stage 2. Symbolic framing. Words, labels, and social categories let the mind compress experience into concepts it can reuse. Stage 3. Integrative reflection. Through practice and feedback, habits and symbolic stories merge, creating deliberate choices that feel intellectual. Research supports this layered structure. Studies of child development link early motor skills and imitation to later problem-solving abilities. Brain imaging separates fast subcortical loops for emotion and habits from the slower cortical networks used for imagining and planning, but also shows that these systems constantly interact. Everyday moments make this clear. A startled cyclist slams the brakes without thinking, then analyzes what happened and chooses a safer path next time. A beginner cook repeats the same motions until timing becomes automatic, then uses understanding to adjust recipes. There is an important paradox. The mind's highest abilities, imagining alternatives, planning far ahead, depend on the reliability of lower-level instincts. If basic routines are inconsistent, higher-level thoughts don't have stable information to work with. The intellect improves and repurposes what instinct provides, turning survival patterns into conscious strategies for change. The practical approach mirrors this. Combine repeated practice with clear language. Build habits that produce reliable information. Name patterns so they can be understood. Use reflection to link what you do with why you do it. Training that blends action with explanation speeds up growth. In short, intellect rises from instinct through layers, symbolic tools, learned reflection, and repeated practice, transforming automatic reactions into organized, thoughtful behavior. This process is gradual, scientific, and open to intentional improvement. The social brain hypothesis. The strongest evidence for the social brain hypothesis is simple. Primates with more complex social groups have larger neocortex regions than those that live alone. This suggests that human intelligence evolved not only to solve physical problems, but to navigate relationships, to track alliances, intentions, reputations, and obligations. Social living creates mental pressure. Predict how someone will react. Keep track of favors. Guess hidden motives. Over generations, these challenges favored brains that could represent the minds of others. Start with the context. Comparative biology links group size with brain development. Anthropology shows that cultural complexity increases as social networks grow denser. Neuroscience finds that the circuits for understanding others, theory of mind, work closely with memory and decision-making systems. Together, these fields argue that intelligence expanded as a social tool, not only a practical one. The mechanisms follow logically. First, perspective-taking. Imagining someone else's viewpoint prevents costly mistakes in cooperation. Second, reputation tracking. Remembering who helps and who cheats keeps large social systems functioning. Third, cultural scaffolding. Shared rules, customs, and institutions support social understanding so people can live in groups larger than biology alone would allow. A clear example is gossip. It acts like a collective memory system, spreading information about reputations faster than direct experience ever could. Rituals and norms act like compression tools, reducing complicated histories into simple signals that guide behavior. In modern life, social thinking shapes reasoning, career decisions, politics, and even shopping habits. Social brains strengthen both cooperation and manipulation. Skills that help groups thrive can also be used to deceive. This tension explains why advanced societies create norms, laws, and institutions that stabilize trust when personal goals conflict. The practical lesson is this: improve social cognition by practicing perspective-taking, keeping track of interactions, and creating predictable norms in groups. The social brain hypothesis reframes intelligence itself. It suggests our minds evolved to understand other minds and to support large-scale cooperation in daily life. The birth of consciousness. Consciousness likely began as an internal narrator that compresses our ongoing experiences into short, useful stories for prediction and communication. Biologically, early brains handled survival through reflexes and simple learning. But the rise of consciousness required something new: the ability to integrate information over time. Neural systems that maintain short-term representations, working memory, and episodic traces made it possible for organisms to hold a sequence of events long enough to guess what might come next. Evolution favored organisms whose inner stories predicted outcomes well and could be shared with others. Three connected mechanisms explain how this emerged. First, temporal binding. Sensory inputs from different channels are synchronized into unified moments, creating coherent snapshots of experience. Second, predictive simulation. Internal models run short mental future scenes that turn perception into expectation. And third, narrative compression. The brain reduces rich experience into compact stories or labels, making information easy to carry for planning and social communication. Evidence from research supports this layered structure. Infants show anticipatory gaze before they even recognize themselves in a mirror, which means prediction develops before a full sense of self. Patients with blind sight can respond to visual stimuli without being consciously aware of them, showing that prediction and integration can operate without verbal access. Brain imaging connects frontal parietal networks to the broadcasting of integrated conscious states, while the hippocampal system provides the time-based structure needed for these states. A meaningful paradox arises here. Consciousness feels smooth and continuous, yet it is actually built from separate steps: binding, simulating, summarizing, running one after another. In practice, strengthening attention, intentional reflection, and sleep-dependent memory consolidation improves the accuracy of this inner reporter. Techniques that stabilize routine input and encourage narrative labeling, such as journaling, interleaved practice, and structured rest, sharpen the clarity of conscious experience. Language and abstract thought. Words act like levers. A single label can lift a confusing cluster of sensations into a clean, stable idea you can examine and use. Language gives us the tools for abstraction. Biologically, humans evolved precise vocal control and rich social learning abilities, letting sounds consistently map onto meanings. Developmentally, children use words to create categories and rehearse actions inside their minds. Neurally, language areas work with memory and executive systems to keep variables active in working memory. 4 mechanisms carry this work. First, labeling compresses information. Names reduce variation and let the mind work on the core idea instead of every specific version of it. Second, recursion allows thoughts to nest inside other thoughts, clauses within clauses, so the mind can represent relationships and rules, not just objects. Third, metaphor shifts structure from a familiar domain to a new one, letting us reason by analogy. Fourth, inner speech transforms public language into a private workspace for planning and reflection. Research gives solid examples. Number words change how children understand counting and arithmetic. Studies across languages show that color and spatial categories shift depending on the labels a language uses. Brain imaging and developmental research link verbal rehearsal to frontal systems that manipulate abstract variables. Consider a practical situation, such as learning probability. Naming outcomes and clearly stating conditional steps helps beginners mentally test different possibilities. Without words, those possibilities stay blurry and unformed. With specific terms, you can rearrange elements and try out scenarios. A paradox appears again. Language expands what we can think about while also smoothing over detail. Labels give us neat units we can easily reason with, but they can also hide edge cases. To make abstract thinking sharper, alternate between giving a concept a clear name and then deliberately unpacking it to reveal its nuance. In short, language is both an enabler and a limiter. It builds the mental spaces where abstract thought runs. Build vocabulary, practice explaining ideas, and use analogy to widen those spaces. Then intentionally break apart labels to keep concepts flexible and accurate. The architecture of the brain. The brain organizes complexity through layers, not with a single commander, but through a cooperative architecture that balances speed, flexibility, memory, and resilience. Start with the evolutionary context. The brain developed through constant trade-offs. Some circuits must act in fractions of a second, while others guide decisions unfolding across minutes, hours, or years. This layering in time and function creates specialized modules, sensory processors, action selectors, value evaluators, integrative controllers, all interacting continuously. A revealing insight is that stability comes from redundancy and specialization working together. Many systems solve similar problems in parallel. When one fails, another can take over. At the same time, specialization keeps the whole system efficient. Neuroanatomy confirms this. Sensory cortices map incoming information with detailed precision. The basal ganglia automate repeated actions. Prefrontal networks coordinate new plans and complex decisions. Three major architectural principles shape how these systems work. First, hierarchy. Lower-level routines run beneath higher-level planners, supplying stable building blocks for more complex actions. Second, modularity with rich connectivity. Modules perform focused tasks yet share summaries and predictions, giving flexibility without chaos. Third, predictive coding. Cortical activity anticipates input, reducing surprise and prioritizing meaningful errors. Concrete examples make this clear. When learning to drive, sensory motor loops automate steering and pedal use, while prefrontal regions observe traffic and adjust plans. In language, auditory and motor systems handle sounds, while semantic networks pull meaning together. Cases from brain injury and developmental conditions show how changing one node reshapes behavior everywhere, revealing both the fragile and adaptable sides of the system. The practical lesson is this. To improve thinking, train both automatic routines and integrative skills. Repetition strengthens reliable building blocks. Varied practice and reflection enhance coordination across modules. Sleep and spaced rehearsal turn these hierarchies into stable patterns. In summary, the brain is a cooperative patchwork, layered, modular, and predictive. This structure trades pure speed for adaptable intelligence, allowing instant reactions when necessary and thoughtful planning when possible. Understanding these principles explains how learning, habits, creativity, and resilience all arise from the same physical framework. The subconsciousness engine. More often than we realize, choices are assembled before they reach our awareness. Brain signals predicting a decision can appear moments before we consciously feel that we made the choice, showing the subconscious as the main engine of action. The subconscious is not a mystical force. It is a powerful, efficient processing layer shaped by evolution and experience. It excels at detecting patterns, running routines, and rapidly rating options so that conscious attention can focus on exceptions rather than everything at once. Evolution rewarded fast, low-cost mental shortcuts, habits that save time, heuristics that lighten mental load, and quick value tags that nudge choices without slow deliberation. 4 core mechanisms explain its strength. Pattern detection compresses experience into templates, faces, routes, tones that can be recognized instantly. Automation stores repeated sequences in the basal ganglia and cerebellum, freeing the cortex for new challenges. Valuation tags options with emotional weight, creating gut-level preferences that guide approach or avoidance. Prediction runs short simulations of likely outcomes, allowing the system to act ahead of time. Examples in daily life make this real. A driver slams the brakes instinctively when a child darts into the street. An experienced negotiator feels something off before any conscious suspicion forms. Priming experiments shift people's choices without them realizing it. Clinical evidence, habit disorders, implicit bias research, and cases of procedural amnesia shows that subconscious systems can guide behavior even without conscious recall. A practical paradox follows. The subconscious is reliable, yet opaque. Its efficiencies make complex life possible, but its shortcuts create biases. To work with it, shape your environment and your repetition. Feed it useful patterns. Practice the behaviors you want until they become automatic. Label routines so you can retrieve them consciously. Use sleep and spaced repetition to consolidate new changes. Small, repeated adjustments reshape the subconscious more effectively than one large rational decision. Perception and constructed reality. What you see is not a perfect picture of the world. It is a continuous hypothesis. Your brain constantly edits reality so that you can act effectively. Perception selects and simplifies. Sensory organs give us information that is often messy and incomplete. The brain's job is to sample that constant flow of signals and figure out what actually matters for our behavior. Evolution favored systems that care more about usefulness than perfect detail, building representations that help us act quickly, not recordings that capture every exact feature. This creates a version of reality shaped heavily by our previous expectations, our focus, and our recent experiences. Four main mechanisms create this constructed perception. First, there is sampling. Our eyes and ears only take small, meaningful pieces of the scene rather than capturing everything at once. Because of this, what we look at and where we place our attention determines most of what we end up noticing. Second, there is prediction. The brain's cortical circuits create expectations and fill in the empty spaces, turning unclear or incomplete signals into stable objects. Third, attentional selection boosts some signals and weakens others, shaping what we see so that it fits our goals in the moment. Fourth, memory and language provide templates that help us label what we sense and stabilize fast-changing impressions into clear categories. There is solid evidence for this view. Optical illusions show us the predictable mistakes between the actual input and the experience we think we had. Studies across cultures reveal that language can shape how people perceive color and space. Research on change blindness shows how large parts of a scene can change without us even noticing. In clinical cases, hallucinations and confabulations reveal what happens when expectations and prior beliefs overpower the actual sensory input. A practical tension comes from this. Constructed perception is fast and efficient, but it can also be wrong. To reduce these predictable errors, we need to adjust both what we sample and the expectations we carry. Slowing down can widen our attention. Actively searching for evidence that challenges our assumptions can improve accuracy. Changing environments and perspectives helps update outdated expectations. Simple habits, like clearly naming what we observe, comparing different viewpoints, and resisting the urge to judge too quickly, help reveal hidden assumptions and improve the reliability of what we perceive. In the end, perception is not a passive recording. It is an active, hypothesis-driven process. By taking control of what we choose to sample, and by testing the expectations we already hold, we can make our constructed reality more trustworthy without losing the speed that makes perception so valuable. Memory as reconstruction. Remembering is not replaying, it is editing. Every time we recall something, we reshape some of the details. Memory becomes not only a record of the past, but also a tool the brain uses in the present. Memory is reconstructive rather than a perfect photographic reproduction. The brain stores bits and pieces, sensory traces, emotional tones, contextual hints, and later reassembles them into a story that feels whole. This rebuilding process prioritizes usefulness over perfect accuracy. Memories that help with decision-making or support our sense of identity tend to survive, even if accuracy fades. Three connected processes explain this reconstructive nature of memory. Encoding filters the experience based on attention and emotion, giving some moments more weight than others. Consolidation during rest and sleep blends new information with what we already know, strengthening certain connections while letting others fade away. Retrieval itself is creative. A cue brings back a partial pattern, and the hippocampus rebuilds the rest with help from our general knowledge and whatever goals we have at that moment. Research makes these effects clear. Eyewitness studies show how information added after an event, or even certain ways of questioning, can plant false details in memory. Repeating a memory, even an inaccurate one, can make it feel increasingly real. Clinical cases where people keep facts but lose vivid personal images show that different memory systems contribute different raw materials to reconstruction. This creates an important paradox. Memory's flexibility helps us adapt and learn, but it also makes us vulnerable to distortion. The constructive quality of memory helps us generalize from past experience, yet it also invites bias and error. Improving reliability means strengthening both encoding and retrieval. Pay close attention during important events. Avoid suggestive or misleading influences afterward. Use precise cues when trying to recall something. Tools outside the brain, notes, timestamps, and photographs, limit how much memory can drift over time. Revisiting the information repeatedly and seeking out different perspectives help correct errors and create a more dependable shared understanding of past events. In everyday life, it helps to accept that memory is interpretive. Treat what you remember as a hypothesis to check rather than as an absolute truth. When conflicts arise, check multiple sources, value consistencies rather than confidence, and use documentation to keep the collective story grounded. Small habits, stronger attention, careful recording, and intentional review push the reconstructive process toward greater accuracy without removing the flexibility that makes memory useful in the first place. The brain as a prediction machine. The brain treats surprise the way it treats threats. Reducing surprise saves energy, but the effort to avoid it can also hide new and useful information. Prediction is at the core of perception and action. Instead of passively waiting for sensory input, the brain creates forward models that guess what signals will arrive next. The real sensory data then come in as feedback that either supports or corrects those predictions. Evolution favored prediction because anticipating outcomes is faster and more efficient than reacting to every new moment from scratch. Three major mechanisms make this possible. First are hierarchical generative models. The lower levels of the brain predict simple sensations, while the higher levels predict larger patterns and underlying causes. This allows the brain to build complex expectations from simpler building blocks. Second is precision weighting. The brain assigns confidence levels to both predictions and sensory input, deciding how strongly an error should update what we believe. Third is prediction error signaling. When there is a mismatch between expectation and reality, that error drives learning, shifts attention, and reallocates brain resources to the places where our models fail. The evidence is strong. Mismatch negativity signals in EEG show that our sensory systems automatically detect deviations before we consciously notice them. Motor control uses prediction to correct movement even before feedback arrives. In daily life, music feels good when it blends predictability with surprise. If it is too predictable, it becomes dull. If it is too unpredictable, it becomes overwhelming. a revealing contradiction appears. Reducing surprise helps create stability, but it can also limit learning. When expectations are too strong, we ignore errors and biases stay in place. The practical lesson is that the best learning happens when the brain faces manageable prediction errors. To teach or change a habit, create moments where expectations are gently broken, just enough to encourage updating without creating overload. Effective strategies include interleaved practice, varying contexts, and encouraging people to make predictions before attempting a task. For perception, slowing down and comparing our expectations with the raw sensory input helps reveal the biases we often overlook. The psychology of mind, behavior, and conditioning. The most dependable way to create new behavior is not through argument, but through consequence. Immediate outcomes shape actions far faster than changes in belief do. Conditioning works as the brain's energy-efficient system for linking actions to results. Classical conditioning pairs certain cues with specific outcomes, so even neutral signals eventually trigger automatic responses. Operant conditioning ties chosen actions to rewards or punishments, shaping the likelihood that those actions will happen again. Evolution built animals with systems, such as dopamine-driven reinforcement pathways and habit circuits in the basal ganglia, that favor strategies that brought consistent benefits in the past. Three core principles explain how behavior changes. First, contingency. Our actions shift when the consequences reliably follow them. Second, schedule sensitivity. Continuous rewards create fast learning but fragile habits, while intermittent reinforcement builds much stronger persistence. Third, discriminative control. Environmental cues signal when certain behaviors will be rewarded, guiding actions toward the right moments and contexts. Concrete examples make these ideas clearer. A manager who praises employees for arriving on time every day sees immediate improvement. If the praise becomes unpredictable, the habit of punctuality lasts even longer. Smartphone apps use variable reward schedules and attention-grabbing cues to make checking behavior feel nearly automatic. Therapy methods like habit reversal insert new, incompatible actions into an old routine and pair them with different consequences. Addiction shows what happens when extremely powerful rewards overpower normal learning systems and shrink a person's range of choices. A revealing contradiction appears. Conditioning helps us adapt quickly, but it also makes behavior rigid. Habits save mental energy, but resist deliberate change. Long-lasting change requires two strategies working together: reshaping the immediate consequences to shift momentum, and adjusting cues and reinforcement schedules so new behaviors gradually become automatic. Practical methods follow from this logic. Make desired behaviors reliably rewarding at the start. Then transition to intermittent reinforcement. Remove cues that trigger unwanted behaviors and add clear cues for better alternatives. Over time, repeated contingencies reshape the field of available choices, and behavior shifts even before beliefs catch up. Small and steady changes to the environment create long-term transformation in everyday behavior with surprising reliability. Motivation and desire. A striking fact is that neural signals tied to motivation, especially dopamine-based value estimates, often predict how much effort someone will put in before they consciously form the intention to act. Motivation is not a stored trait, but a real-time calculation that compares expected reward against immediate cost. Evolution created systems designed to estimate worth. How rewarding will this be? How much effort or risk will it require? The brain allocates energy based on these rapid calculations, which happen below awareness and combine external incentives, recent experiences, and a person's sense of identity. Start with valuation. The brain tags options with expected utility, giving stronger signals to outcomes that have reliably paid off in the past. Next comes attention and salience bias. Only the options we notice enter the decision space at all. Third comes effort allocation. Circuits in the basal ganglia and frontal regions decide whether the potential reward is worth the required work. Finally, identity and personal narrative modulate all three. When a goal aligns with someone's sense of self, the perceived cost decreases and sustained motivation increases. Empirical examples make the structure visible. In laboratory tasks, people put in more time or physical effort when the predicted reward is higher. In real settings, identity-based prompts, like telling someone, "You are a runner," boost gym attendance more effectively than offering general incentives. A clear paradox emerges. Small changes in perceived cost or identity often create larger behavior shifts than large changes in declared goals. The practical implication is straightforward. Increase the perceived value while lowering the friction at the same time. Make rewards immediate and meaningful. Reduce physical or mental barriers. Connect actions to a person's identity using techniques like labeling or pre-commitment. Pair new habits with rewarding cues. Create structures that reduce impulsive choice. Over weeks, these small optimizations reshape the brain's cost-benefit landscape, making motivation arise naturally instead of through force. Emotion as information. The body often signals important information before we consciously understand what we feel. Physiological changes appear before emotional reports, showing that emotions function as early data, not just as inner experiences. Emotions work as informational shortcuts that compress complicated circumstances into quick, actionable signals. Evolution shaped emotional responses to highlight opportunities and threats, direct attention, and influence learning. Rather than distracting us, emotions help us understand which details matter most. Three functions make emotions valuable. First is prioritization. A sudden feeling of alarm narrows attention toward immediate danger, while contentment opens space for exploration and learning. Second is valuation. Emotions like comfort, disgust, and curiosity quickly assign weight to options, so we don't rely solely on slow reasoning. Third is learning modulation. Events with emotional intensity are remembered more strongly, helping future expectations adapt to important experiences. Empirical evidence shows this structure clearly. Autonomic reactions, such as changes in heart rate and skin conductance, often come before a person reports feeling fear, meaning the body provides data ahead of conscious awareness. Research on affective forecasting shows how poorly people predict future emotions, revealing that current feelings offer immediate guidance but are not perfect long-term predictors. Clinical conditions like alexithymia, in which people have trouble identifying their emotions, impair decision-making and highlight how much emotion contributes to usable information. A paradox arises. Emotions both clarify and distort. They simplify complex situations by highlighting what matters, but they also bias judgment when the signals reflect temporary states or unrelated causes. Practical strategies follow. First, treat emotions like data by naming them. Labeling adds clarity and reduces confusion. Second, check the source and timescale of the feeling. Ask whether the emotion arises from the present moment or from something unrelated. Third, pause briefly before acting to gather a clearer sample of the emotional signal. In daily life, rely on emotion as a fast filter, but not as the final decision. Combine emotional cues with simple verification. Label the feeling, locate its cause, and give it a moment. This keeps the useful speed of emotion while reducing systematic mistakes. When emotions feel unclear, invite other perspectives and keep track of recurring patterns. Personality and temperament. Identical twins raised in separate environments often show striking similarities in temperament, reactivity, sociability, and emotional style, demonstrating how biological tendencies shape life patterns. Temperament appears early in life, influenced by genetics, prenatal development, and the brain's initial wiring. Personality develops over time as these innate tendencies interact with experience, culture, and the narratives people create about themselves. The result is a stable pattern of tendencies that predict behavior without strictly determining every action. Three linked processes explain both how personality remains stable and how it can change. First is evocative feedback. Inborn traits affect how others react to someone, and those reactions reinforce the original tendencies. Second is niche selection. People naturally move toward environments that fit their dispositions, which strengthens trait expression. Third is self-construction. Repeated behaviors become part of identity through the stories people tell about themselves, turning tendencies into long-term personality. Research offers solid evidence. Scientists use surveys, observation, and physiological measurements to map temperament and track development. Programs in coaching, habit design, and structured support show measurable personality-related shifts over months. Long-term studies demonstrate moderate stability in traits across decades. Intervention research shows that deliberate practice and context change can shift behavior tied to traits, even when underlying temperament stays the same. Everyday experience reflects this interplay. Someone naturally persistent can learn better strategies for effort. Someone highly reactive can learn emotional regulation skills that change how they appear to others. A paradox follows. Stability and change exist together. Temperament shapes the probabilities of our responses, but does not script our lives. Practical change is ecological and gradual. Shift environments. Build routines that create new automatic responses. Rewrite personal narratives to support new patterns. Small environmental adjustments, consistent habits, social support, and targeted feedback alter long-term trajectories more effectively than motivation alone. Understanding temperament explains tendencies without excusing them, and provides a realistic path for growth through sustained effort over time. The formation of the self. People change who they are not mainly by dwelling on their past, but by repeatedly stepping into small futures that feel believable. The formation of the self is as much about imagining what comes next as it is about remembering what already happened, all built on a biological foundation of temperament and neural tendencies. Humans build layers of social scripts and imagined paths that help them decide how to act. Children learn labels and roles, then teenagers experiment with possible versions of themselves, and adults shape and narrow these options through practice and feedback. What eventually becomes me is often the future we rehearse again and again in our minds, and the way others respond to the behaviors we project. Three main mechanisms explain this forward-focused structure. First, prospection. Our ability to mentally create realistic future scenarios gives us target states to move toward. Vivid imagined outcomes guide our attention, influence our goals, and shape our memory so it favors information that helps us progress. Second, social calibration. People react to the behaviors we project, and their recognition or correction either strengthens our emerging identity or trims it away. Third, embodied repetition. Repeated actions, little rituals, routines, roles, turn imagined futures into automatic patterns that eventually feel like stable traits. Evidence strongly supports the idea that the future plays a larger role in shaping us than the past. Research on goal setting shows that visualizing achievable identities drives behavior change more effectively than replaying past mistakes. Narrative therapy also depends on imagined future selves to rebuild habits and social roles. Everyday examples show the same idea in practice. Someone who repeatedly imagines, "I am a morning person," and arranges social check-ins to support that identity will, over time, reliably align their actions with this vision far more than someone who simply remembers staying up late. A revealing paradox follows. The self feels like a story of our past, but it is often a plan being carried out. The feeling of stability comes from practicing a small set of anticipated behaviors in social environments that reinforce them. To change identity, we must design believable future scenarios, create predictable social feedback, and repeat small actions until they become automatic. These steps shift the mind from preserving who you were to actively shaping who you will become. Cognitive biases and heuristics. Simple heuristics often outperform slow, detailed reasoning in everyday environments because they are compact rules shaped by real-world regularities, not flaws in thinking. Biases and heuristics are adaptations, not accidents. The mind compresses complex problems into noticeable cues and simple rules so decisions can be fast and low effort. Evolution and experience tune these shortcuts to typical conditions, and when conditions change, the same shortcuts that help us can produce consistent, predictable mistakes instead of random errors. Three mechanisms explain these predictable failures. First, representational compression. The brain encodes summaries and key features, so judgments rely on simplified inputs. Second, availability and anchoring. Whatever comes easily to mind, or whatever starting point we're given, strongly influences our estimates, because recalling and adjusting is far easier than recalculating from scratch. Third, framing and model activation. The way a situation is described activates a particular mental model, which selects a certain heuristic and shapes the outcome even when the underlying facts remain the same. Real-world evidence makes this pattern clear. The availability heuristic makes rare but dramatic events feel common after exposure. Anchoring pushes negotiation results toward the first offer placed on the table. Framing changes people's risk preferences when identical information is presented as a loss versus a gain. Across countless lab and real-world studies, the same directional biases appear consistently and predictably. A paradox emerges. Heuristics help us act skillfully in familiar contexts, yet they require correction in statistical or unfamiliar environments. Practical steps, therefore, divide. In routine situations, design environments so heuristics naturally guide people toward good actions. Use clear defaults, immediate feedback, and obvious cues. When accuracy truly matters, externalize the thinking. Check base rates, use checklists, look for counterexamples, and slow down to recalculate. This way, we keep the speed of intuition where it works and bring precision where it is necessary. In essence, cognitive shortcuts are powerful mental tools with well-known failure modes, and managing them depends on designing context wisely and using deliberate procedures to support or correct our natural heuristics. The balance of logic and emotion. Emotion and logic operate as separate yet deeply interconnected systems. Emotion gives immediate value and urgency, while logic provides long-term structure and consistency. Good decisions come from the alignment of both. Across evolution, humans developed quick emotional signals to mark what matters and higher-level thinking systems to imagine possible futures. Emotion directs attention and creates urgency, while logic forms general rules and weighs consequences. Their interaction is a negotiation that balances short-term feelings with long-term plans. Three mechanisms clarify how this balance works. Evaluation. Emotional responses assign weight and immediacy, producing a priority map for the mind. Representation. Logical systems build abstract models and rules that apply across situations. Arbitration. Executive brain networks compare emotional urgency with logical limits, adjusting when to act and when to pause. Evidence supports this psychological structure. Patients who lack emotional signals can think clearly but struggle to commit to decisions. People with frontal lobe injuries often retain desire but lose the ability to plan. Experiments show that mood and framing can shift risk-taking, even when the facts stay exactly the same. Everyday experiences show the same pattern. An intense alarm can trigger instant rescue behavior, and later reflection can create better routines to prevent future emergencies. A paradox appears here too. Emotion gives purpose and energy, but it can also distort judgment. Logic creates consistency, but it can feel empty without emotional meaning. The practical method is integration. First, name the feeling to acknowledge its importance. Then state a clear rule to guide behavior. Choose the action that honors both the emotional urgency and the logical boundaries. If frustration pushes someone to correct a problem immediately, they can pause to label the feeling, choose a non-escalating rule, and take the least harmful corrective step repeatedly over time. Pairing explicit emotion labeling with simple rules gradually shifts automatic responses so they support long-term goals. This approach keeps the speed and energy of emotion while using logic to avoid repeated mistakes, leading to everyday decisions that are both meaningful and dependable. Practice over time makes these changes solid. Learning and adaptation. Learning is less about gathering facts and more about tuning the mind's internal models so they predict outcomes accurately. The better your internal model, the fewer costly surprises you encounter. All organisms face changing environments, and adaptation adjusts behavior to match those changes. Evolution provides the basic flexibility and learning mechanisms, while experience fills in the details. The mind learns by recognizing patterns, updating expectations, and shifting resources toward strategies that consistently work. Three mechanisms drive effective adaptation. First, error-driven updating. Prediction errors mark mismatches between expectation and reality, triggering model adjustments. In the brain, dopamine signals help reinforce actions that lead to better outcomes. Second, transfer and abstraction. The mind extracts the underlying structure of experiences so lessons apply across different situations, turning specific successes into general rules. Third, meta-learning. The mind learns how to learn, adjusting how fast it updates, how widely it explores new options, and what it pays attention to. Practical examples show how this works. A new driver learns control by repeatedly correcting mistakes, and adaptable drivers shift their cues quickly when conditions change. In education, mixing different types of problems leads to stronger learning transfer than repeating a single type. Organizations that run small experiments and update policies based on clear results adapt far more quickly than those that rely on fixed plans. A final paradox emerges. Stability helps learning, yet too much stability stops adaptation. The mind needs consistency to build good models, but it also needs variation to keep those models flexible. Predictable environments allow internal models to stabilize and converge. Volatile environments, by contrast, require flexible exploration. The practical takeaway is this: structure your learning with variability you can control. Give yourself clear feedback. Introduce moderate novelty to trigger useful updates, and practice forming abstractions by comparing different examples. For deliberate, intentional change, three tactics help. Make your goals specific and measurable so that prediction errors become informative rather than confusing. Expose yourself to varied contexts to encourage transfer, and reflect on your strategies so you can adjust how you learn. Sleep, spaced practice, and immediate corrective feedback all speed up consolidation. In short, learning and adaptation are ongoing calibration processes. Notice errors, extract patterns, and tune the way you learn. By designing environments that offer informative surprises and consistent practice, you convert experience into dependable, adaptable skill. Over time, these iterative adjustments compound into durable competence. The mirror of society. A person's attitudes and choices are often predicted more accurately by their close social network than by their age or income. Society functions as the mirror in which the mind learns its own outline. From infancy onward, we absorb norms, labels, and common ways of reasoning by sampling people around us, peers, caretakers, communities, and institutions. Over time, these inputs harden into heuristics, social shortcuts that save mental effort but also reproduce biases. Four mechanisms explain how social networks shape minds. First, social sampling. We estimate what is common or probable based on the people we regularly encounter. When a local group is very uniform, it produces strong consensus, even if the wider world is different. Second, normative reinforcement. Repeated approval or disapproval forms internal norms that guide behavior. Third, identity signaling. Adopting certain beliefs signals group membership, which helps secure cooperation and resources. Fourth, institutional compression. Routines, rituals, and media condense long cultural histories into simple cues that guide daily action. Concrete examples make this visible. Echo chambers can inflate rare opinions into perceived majorities. Workplace cultures quietly set standards for what counts as professional, punctual, or ambitious. Political polarization grows when contact between groups drops and selective exposure increases. And there are positive cases too. Public health campaigns use visible compliance and shared norms to shift behavior across entire populations. A revealing paradox follows. Minds both reflect society and reshape it. Shared environments channel thought, yet coordinated actions by individuals can reorganize those same environments. Small, consistent behaviors, new norms, repeated practices, and transparent institutions can cascade into large cultural changes. The practical implication is clear. To change thinking, change your social inputs. Diversify your networks. Adopt norms that reward critical thinking. And build institutional cues that make desired behaviors visible and repeatable. When evaluating strong beliefs, look beyond your immediate circle. Compare them to base rates and actively seek disconfirming evidence. In short, the social mirror shapes cognition by selecting samples, enforcing norms, signaling identity, and compressing culture into cues. Steering collective minds requires small, sustained adjustments to these social mirrors. Different reflections produce different selves over time. The mind-body connection is a continuous loop. Sensory organs send information to the brain, but internal bodily signals, interoception, also shape thoughts and judgments. Evolution equipped organisms to track internal states because hunger, arousal, and fatigue reliably predict which actions will succeed. Modern neuroscience shows that these bodily signals reach the insular cortex, limbic structures, and prefrontal circuits, where they influence attention, memory, and decision-making. Four mechanisms explain how bodily states steer the mind. First, interoceptive signaling. Signals from the internal organs give the brain a constant estimate of energy, safety, and readiness, coloring how the world is perceived. Second, neurochemical modulation. Hormones and neural modulators, such as cortisol, adrenaline, and dopamine, change learning rates and risk tolerance. Third, sensory motor loops. Our actions alter the environment and send internal feedback that forms learning patterns and embeds habits. Fourth, embodied rehearsal. Repeating physical routines converts goals into automatic responses, reducing cognitive load. Concrete examples make this practical. A brief walk balances stress hormones and improves problem solving. Adjusting posture before a presentation lowers reported anxiety and sharpens communication. Sleep-dependent consolidation connects daytime bodily rhythms with nighttime memory strengthening. Clinical cases such as chronic pain or sleep deprivation show how persistent bodily disruptions gradually reshape attention, mood, and motivation. A revealing contradiction emerges. The very mechanisms that make the body a reliable source of information also create distortions. Acute arousal sharpens attention but narrows reasoning. Chronic stress diverts resources away from long-term planning. To use the link effectively, create stable bodily inputs, regulate sleep, schedule simple movement breaks, use breathing-based resets, and build new routines with clear cues. In short, the brain reads the body to decide what matters. Small, repeated bodily practices change the signals the brain relies on, and over time, those altered signals reshape thinking, habit formation, and identity itself. The limits of mind. Overthinking and rumination often disguise themselves as useful mental work, yet they usually act as rehearsals for fear. Overthinking gives us the impression that we're gathering helpful information, but the more we keep replaying different possibilities in our minds, the less capable we become of actually testing those ideas in real life. Rumination is a repetitive and often negative cycle of thoughts that revisits past events or spins endless what-ifs about the future. Unlike real planning, which leads to clear, testable steps, rumination circles around the same scenarios without ever committing to action. Cognitive science shows that this pattern puts a heavy load on working memory. It skews our recall toward negative details and heightens emotional arousal, creating a self-sustaining mental loop that looks like productive thinking, but actually narrows our options. 4 mechanisms explain why these loops don't stop. First is attentional capture. Intrusive thoughts keep pulling our mental focus away from tasks that actually matter. Second is memory bias. Our minds selectively recall information that supports our worries, making the problem look bigger and more threatening. Third is affect amplification. Constant focus on threats raises anxiety levels, which then weakens cognitive control even more. Fourth is action inhibition. Rumination replaces real-world experimentation with endless mental simulation, delaying the feedback that could reduce uncertainty. We all see these patterns in everyday life, replaying a small social mistake instead of simply reaching out to fix it, or editing an email over and over instead of finally sending it. Research consistently links rumination to poorer problem solving and slower recovery after setbacks. The paradox is obvious. All the mental effort feels like control, but it actually keeps uncertainty in place by preventing decisive action. The practical solution follows a simple logic: reduce unhelpful mental rehearsal and increase fast, real-world feedback. You can time box your worrying, limit it to 10 minutes. Externalize the loop. Write down your core concern and choose one small, testable action. Then run a quick behavioral experiment and record what actually happens. Use environmental cues like setting an alarm to trigger real action. Practice labeling your thoughts so they trigger less emotional reactivity, and use physical resets like short walks or breathing exercises to interrupt the escalation.
Over time, these small shifts help the brain move from repetitive looping to real sampling of experience, replacing imagined scenarios with concrete evidence.
Cognitive dissonance appears whenever our actions, beliefs, or self-image conflict with each other. That uncomfortable tension creates a strong motivation to resolve the mismatch, either by changing our beliefs, adjusting our behavior, or reframing how we interpret the past. From an evolutionary viewpoint, stable self-narratives reduce social friction and help us make faster decisions. Psychologically, reducing dissonance saves mental energy and protects a consistent sense of identity. Three mechanisms drive this process. First is inconsistency detection. Monitoring systems in the prefrontal cortex flag mismatches between what we expect and what we do, creating an uncomfortable internal signal. Second is motivated inference. The mind selectively retrieves and emphasizes evidence that supports the preferred story, minimizing the sense of conflict through confirmation and availability biases. Third is action or narrative revision. People either change their behavior to match their beliefs, reinterpret events so they align with their sense of self, or adopt new compensatory beliefs that restore coherence. Empirical examples make these ideas clearer. Effort justification shows that people value outcomes more when they've worked hard to achieve them. Post-choice spreading of alternatives leads us to like our chosen option more while downgrading the one we rejected. Moral licensing shows that after a good or virtuous action, people often feel entitled to loosen their restraint, balancing dissonance between self-image and temptation. Studies using choice paradigms and neuroimaging reveal both behavioral changes and reduced conflict signals following rationalization. A telling paradox emerges. The same mechanisms that protect a stable sense of self also distort judgment and limit learning. In practice, the way to reduce harmful dissonance is to create environments where contradictions can be noticed without threat. Seek external feedback. Pre-commit to using testable criteria. Document your decisions and reasons before outcomes unfold. Adopt a habit of generating specific, falsifiable hypotheses instead of vague defenses. When you notice yourself rationalizing, ask what single concrete action could disprove your preferred narrative. If no such action exists, treat the belief as provisional. The illusion of control. The illusion of control shows up because people naturally prefer doing something over doing nothing, even when the outcome is a matter of chance. That urge to act makes us feel in control, but it often blocks us from learning how things actually work. This illusion comes from adaptive heuristics. Humans evolved to detect links between actions and outcomes because it was crucial for survival. But these systems are biased. We tend to overestimate our influence when events happen frequently, when we get to choose the action, or when outcomes follow closely in time. Several cognitive drivers contribute to this illusion. Pattern seeking, where we find structure even when none exists. Contingency misattribution, where we credit our action for a coincidental success. Action bias, where we prefer acting just to reduce discomfort from uncertainty. And avoidance of corrective feedback, where we ignore disconfirming information to preserve a feeling of agency. Everyday examples show this clearly. Gamblers prefer throwing the dice themselves, use personal rituals, and treat lucky streaks as signs of skill. Managers who micromanage attribute team success to their oversight and blame failure on lack of willpower instead of unpredictable conditions. Investors confuse short-term wins for genuine skill and then take on more risk. The end result is overconfidence, misdirected effort, and poor learning. Another paradox emerges.
Feeling in control reduces anxiety and increases persistence, yet it also weakens our calibration and adaptability. To resolve this tension, separate situations into what you can control and what you cannot. Practical tactics follow from this. First, identify which variables you can realistically influence and which ones are outside your reach. Second, set short, falsifiable tests for any intervention and document your outcomes. Third, use default policies and pre-commitments to prevent unnecessary action. Fourth, rely on external base rate data and clear feedback systems to keep your judgment grounded. 5. Replace rituals with experiments. Perform an action only to test a prediction, not simply to feel better. Over time, this approach shifts your behavior away from actions driven by illusion and toward interventions driven by real evidence. Act when the results of a test show that something works. Stop when they do not, and save comfort rituals for situations where the stakes are low.
The comfort zone trap. Comfort maximizes the payoff you get right now by reducing surprise, but the same process gradually narrows the range of behaviors that can create future growth. The comfort zone is a familiar, reliable state. Your routines reduce error, conserve energy, and lead to predictable outcomes. On a neurological level, predictable successes increase reward signals and reduce the brain's drive to explore. Behaviorally, repetition automates performance and turns it into habits that require very little attention. In stable environments, this is efficient. The trap appears when the environment changes or when the benefits of routine start declining. What once saved resources now limits learning and adaptability. 3 mechanisms explain how this trap forms. First is reward-driven narrowing. Repeated success strengthens the strategies that created it, making you favor exploitation instead of exploration. Second is attentional narrowing. Familiar tasks require less mental effort, so new signals are less likely to be noticed or learned. Third is reinforcement inertia. Occasional rewards for routine behavior make change feel costly, so the system resists shifting toward alternatives that carry more perceived risk. Evidence of this appears everywhere. Skill plateaus in sports and music often follow long periods of repetitive practice. Innovation research shows that companies focused too heavily on short-term metrics usually underinvest in exploratory projects. Behavioral studies connect stable rewards to reduced curiosity and slower adjustment to new conditions. A practical, low-risk way to escape this trap pairs small variations with protected time. Introduce bounded novelty, tiny challenges that expand what you might try without jeopardizing your core performance. Mix variable forms of practice with short, scheduled experiments. Protect your exploratory time by allowing a safe budget for failure. Use prompts that push you into different perspectives. Track small prediction errors and treat them as useful information instead of threats. In short, comfort offers stability but limits adaptability. To increase your capacity, design small recurring chances to explore, record what happens, and integrate what works. Over months, those minor variations accumulate and grow into greater resilience and capability. The Dunning-Kruger effect. The people who perform the worst often rate themselves the highest because their errors hide both the cause of the mistake and the understanding required to notice it. Real competence gives you the tools to recognize your own lack of competence. Cognitive shortcuts and limited feedback create the Dunning-Kruger pattern. Beginners lack both the skill in the domain and the meta-knowledge needed to judge their own performance. Without reliable benchmarks, small successes feel like breakthroughs. Meanwhile, skilled people see more nuance and exceptions, so they judge themselves more cautiously. This is not just about arrogance or humility, it is a gap in metacognitive insight. Four mechanisms create the effect. First is feedback scarcity. When results are noisy or slow to appear, people infer their skill from just a few signals. Second is diagnostic blindness. Beginners don't yet know which mistakes actually matter, so they misjudge quality. Third is social reinforcement. Echo chambers and selective praise lock inflated self-estimates into place. Fourth is feedback avoidance. Accepting low skill feels threatening to identity, so people downplay corrective information. Concrete examples make this clear. In workplace reviews, vague praise leads employees to overestimate their abilities. In learning environments, students who receive only grades and not detailed criticism remain unaware of their specific weaknesses. Experiments show that calibration improves sharply when learners get immediate item-level feedback and receive training on how experts evaluate performance. A revealing paradox emerges. Confidence without accuracy can encourage practice, but unchecked confidence prevents helpful correction. Practical solutions must balance both sides. Keep motivation strong while making feedback more precise. Use micro-assessments with clear benchmarks. Seek out evaluation that challenges your assumptions from peers you trust. Adopt checklists that put standards into a visible form. Practice exercises that help you identify errors and learn diagnostic cues. Promote a culture that accepts low-stakes failure and quick correction. Over time, these habits turn hidden mistakes into valuable information. Calibration becomes a skill in itself. The better you get, the more clearly you can see where improvement is still needed. Decision fatigue. After making many decisions, people consistently choose easier default options, not out of laziness, but because the brain protects its limited resources by shifting toward low-cost strategies. Every decision uses attention and working memory capacity. To manage these limits, the brain relies on fast heuristics early on, and as decisions accumulate, it favors defaults, habits, or emotionally charged shortcuts. This pattern conserves energy but weakens judgment as time goes on and creates inconsistencies. Three mechanisms work together to produce decision fatigue. First is depletion signaling. Neuromodulatory systems track accumulated mental demands and lower the threshold for effortful control. Second is heuristic reliance. When control weakens, the mind uses familiar rules of thumb and pre-learned responses. Third is default drift. Repeated decisions make the easiest path the most likely choice. Defaults, procrastination, and good enough solutions rise in frequency. Real-world examples show the consequences clearly. Judges issue more lenient rulings after breaks. Shoppers make impulsive purchases at checkout after long periods of browsing. Managers default to simple metrics late in the workday. Decision fatigue flattens decision quality and amplifies inequality, especially when only some people can delegate or automate choices. The practical remedy is simple. Reduce unnecessary choices. Automate predictable decisions and schedule high-stakes ones when your mental energy is fresh. Techniques include setting defaults, planning meals in advance, creating email rules, and batching low-value decisions. Allocate dedicated windows for complex decisions. Use checklists to externalize criteria and take short restorative breaks, brief walks, hydration, or structured micro-rest moments. Track outcomes over time to make sure your defaults still serve you well and adjust them when needed. The spotlight effect. When someone enters a room, they often greatly overestimate how much others notice them, sometimes by a factor of 3, because they mistake their own inner focus for actual public attention. The spotlight effect describes how we assume our private thoughts, mistakes, or emotions are obvious to everyone around us. Psychologically, it comes from the privileged access you have to your own signals. Your sensations, discomfort, and attention feel so vivid internally that your mind projects them outward as if others are experiencing them too. Evolution favored sensitivity to social attention, so believing others notice you can be adaptive in small amounts. But this tendency consistently inflates your sense of being watched. 3 mechanisms create this effect. First is anchoring on self-generated cues. Your internal sensations and focus become reference points that you assume others share. Second is limited perspective taking. Humans struggle to accurately simulate other people's viewpoints and often default to their own. Third is memory weighting. Recent embarrassing experiences stay active in your working memory, making them feel much more significant than they appear to anyone else. The evidence is clear and intuitive. Studies show that people expect strangers to remember a slightly embarrassing shirt much more than strangers actually do. In social situations, a moment of silence or a small stumble feels huge to the person experiencing it, but to listeners, it becomes just a brief, forgettable moment. The spotlight effect distorts feedback loops. Fear of being noticed increases self-monitoring, which reduces natural behavior and ironically increases the feeling of awkwardness. A helpful paradox emerges. Overestimating visibility can motivate you to prepare well, but it also increases anxiety without improving results. The practical strategies follow naturally. Externalize reality. Ask for direct feedback instead of assuming. Run small exposure experiments. Wear the unusual shirt and see how people actually react. Practice shifting perspectives. Deliberately imagine the situation from the viewpoint of several strangers, and build the habit of sampling time. Reflect on events hours or days later to see how little they mattered. Notice how long people actually dwell on an incident. When you look closely, you'll see that most people move on much faster than we assume. In reality, the spotlight effect is simply a bias of projection. You loosen its grip when you replace assumptions with actual measurements. Test things, ask questions, recalibrate your expectations, and your social world will start to feel less harsh, less glaring, and much more manageable. The hedonic treadmill. Today, let's look at the hedonic treadmill. Getting more in life doesn't automatically bring lasting happiness because the mind updates its reference points faster than our achievements or gains can pile up. The hedonic treadmill describes how positive events, like a new income level, a new relationship, or a major accomplishment, give a temporary boost to our mood, but then fade as our expectations adjust and our attention drifts elsewhere. This isn't simple forgetfulness. Psychologically, the mind recalibrates what it considers normal, and it shifts attention toward whatever is missing next. Neurologically, our reward systems fire strongly when something is new, but they adapt quickly with repeated exposure, lowering the emotional impact of things that once felt exciting. 3 main mechanisms explain why the treadmill keeps moving. First is attentional migration. After life improves in some way, attention naturally drifts toward whatever deficiencies remain, or toward new possibilities we haven't reached yet, which makes satisfaction feel temporary. Second is reference recalibration. We silently reset our baseline by comparing our current circumstances to updated standards, so what felt like a win yesterday feels ordinary today. Third is goal escalation. Reaching a goal often creates a bigger or different goal, generating a kind of constant forward momentum where desire grows faster than contentment. Research backs up these ideas. Long-term studies show that income is connected to life satisfaction only up to a certain point, after which people quickly adapt.
Relationship research shows that initial enthusiasm fades as partners become familiar. Brain imaging reveals that dopamine responses drop with repeated rewards. This leads to a fascinating paradox. Striving to improve our lives increases our skills in material comfort, but it also speeds up the recalibration that makes those improvements feel less rewarding over time. Upward mobility can leave contentment feeling just out of reach. That's why practical strategies focus on shifting the dynamics of adaptation instead of fighting desire itself. Introduce novelty slowly. Rotate experiences instead of constantly intensifying them. Practice savoring by deliberately paying attention to positive moments so their emotional signal lasts longer. Anchor your gratitude by recording it in a concrete way so your reference point doesn't shift so quickly. Turn gains into repeated experiences or rituals rather than simply acquiring more possessions. And set goal processes, like daily habits or relationship routines, instead of relying only on big outcome goals. Processes create a steady flow of varied, repeated experiences that resist rapid habituation. Over months, these small practices change the speed at which your reference point moves, slowing the treadmill and making real increases in well-being last longer. Now let's turn to anxiety and depression. These are not only emotional states, they are different patterns in how the brain responds when uncertainty or expected cost overwhelm its predictive systems. Evolution wired us to detect danger and conserve energy to stay alive. Anxiety ramps up threat prediction and readiness. Depression lowers expected reward and narrows behavior in order to reduce the cost of exploration. In ancestral environments, these patterns protected survival. They helped avoid predators or conserve energy during scarcity. But in modern life, chronic stress, complicated social environments, and constant ambiguity can miscalibrate these systems, turning once adaptive alarms into disabling patterns. 4 mechanisms explain how normal regulation turns into disorder. First is threat amplification. A hyperactive salience network increases vigilance and false alarms, making harmless cues feel dangerous. Second is value downregulation. When reward sensitivity drops, motivation flattens and actions no longer give the reinforcement they used to. Third is behavioral narrowing. Avoidance and withdrawal cut off the new information that could correct the brain's miscalibrations, creating a vicious feedback loop. Fourth is interference with learning. High arousal or very low engagement disrupts the brain's ability to consolidate experiences and update its internal models. As a result, maladaptive patterns persist even when they're no longer accurate. Research supports this structure. Brain imaging shows amygdala hyperreactivity in anxiety and reduced ventral striatal responses in depression. Long-term studies show chronic stress predicting later mood disorders. Behavioral experiments demonstrate how avoidance stops people from discovering that their fearful beliefs are inaccurate. Here again, a practical paradox appears. The same systems that protected our ancestors can imprison us today. Effective responses aim to recalibrate these signals. Combine low-risk behavioral tests, graded exposure, and activity scheduling with predictable feedback. Use habit tracking, external rewards, and supportive social input from trusted observers. Protect sleep, include short bursts of movement, and time your nutrition to restore the neurochemical rhythms that help the brain learn again. When necessary, clinical interventions like CBT, medication, or guided behavioral experiments can speed up the recalibration process. Next, let's talk about trauma and healing. Trauma often doesn't live primarily in stories. It lives in the body's predictions. The nervous system learns danger long before the mind forms a narrative. Traumatic experiences tuned the threat system. The body speeds up, attention narrows, and memories fragment so that sensations, rather than coherent stories, trigger alarm.
This tuning was once adaptive for immediate survival, but it becomes harmful when the danger is past. The result is flashbacks, hypervigilance, avoidance, and withdrawal. Neuroscience links these effects to heightened amygdala activity, altered hippocampal context encoding, and weakened prefrontal regulation. Behaviorally, they form patterns that block corrective feedback. That's why healing requires repair across multiple channels. First comes stabilization. You rebuild a sense of safety through routines, sleep, and simple somatic practices, things like breath regulation and paced movement that lower arousal. Second is tethering. You rebuild social support networks with people who act as steady, trustworthy witnesses, consistently showing through their behavior that the world is not uniformly dangerous. Third is narrative integration. Under safe conditions, you gradually connect fragmented sensations to context and meaning, often with therapeutic guidance that avoids re-traumatization. Fourth is targeted relearning. Techniques such as graded exposure and reconsolidation help update threat predictions by pairing old scary cues with new, non-threatening outcomes. Concrete examples help illustrate this process. A survivor might begin by using grounding exercises and good sleep habits to reduce nightly hyperarousal. Then they might practice short, supported exposures, like walking briefly past a location associated with fear while tracking their physical and emotional responses. Later, they might work with a therapist to put words and context around those memories. Social signals also matter. Calm, consistent responses from peers accelerate relearning. There are also practical, low-friction steps. Prioritize sleep and regular movement. Schedule 2 short grounding practices each day. Make a small list of trusted people to reach out to. Run micro-experiments that test safety, like a 10-minute exposure with a clear exit plan, and keep simple behavioral notes to track progress. Professional help, such as trauma-informed therapy or medical support, can greatly amplify these effects when needed. The philosophy of mind. The philosophy of mind presents a profound puzzle, often called the hard problem of consciousness. Neural activity can explain behavior and the ability to report experiences. Yet it does not by itself explain why these processes are accompanied by subjective experience, the what-it's-like quality that makes our inner life distinct. The hard problem names this explanatory gap. Philosophers often point to 2 key contrasts. On one hand, we have objective descriptions. On the other, subjective appearances. Scientists can map correlations between brain states and reported experience, and progress does narrow empirical territory, but it still leaves a central question unanswered. Why does a functioning, predictive, and integrative system generate qualitative feelings rather than merely manipulating symbols? 3 interconnected observations help clarify this issue. First, empirical constraints. Dissociations, such as those seen in blind sight or under anesthesia, show that behavioral competence can exist without conscious report, revealing which functional conditions are necessary for experience. Second, explanatory mismatch. Standard causal descriptions rely on categories like neurons, spikes, or networks, which do not naturally translate into phenomenology. The resulting gap may reflect a category error rather than a missing fact. Third, methodological leverage. Productive approaches treat consciousness as a target property with measurable functional signatures, like global ignition, recurrent processing, or integrated information, creating testable bridges. Concrete examples help illustrate this. In blind sight, sensory processing occurs without integrated broadcasting, resulting in behavior without felt experience. Anesthesia disrupts network-level integration, eliminating reportable consciousness. Trained meditators can alter their phenomenology while producing identifiable neural shifts. These examples reveal where mechanisms and reports diverge and where bridging hypotheses can be falsified. The practical posture toward consciousness is twofold. First, keep pressing empirical bridges, identifying precise functional markers that predict subjective reports. Second, practice conceptual pluralism, seeking transformations that relate third-person descriptions to first-person predicates. By accepting a provisional toolkit that combines mechanistic mapping with phenomenological taxonomy, science can advance without prematurely claiming a final metaphysical solution. The debate between dualism and materialism illustrates a precise paradox. Our best physical descriptions predict behavior and neural correlates, yet they leave open the question of whether subjective experience is merely those processes or something over and above them. Dualism and materialism provide opposing answers. Dualism posits that mental phenomena are fundamentally distinct from physical processes, while materialism holds that mental states are physical or fully realized by them. Historically, dualism preserved the intuition that qualia and agency resist reduction, whereas materialism pursued unity and empirical tractability. Contemporary debates matter because they shape research priorities, clinical reasoning, and ethical decision-making. Begin with constrained comparisons. Materialist approaches, whether reductive, identity-based, functional, or emergent, explain mental capacities in terms of neural organization, information processing, or system-level dynamics. They generate testable hypotheses, correlate injuries with loss of capacities, manipulate circuits to observe predictable changes, or even build functional analogs in machines. Dualist positions, in contrast, emphasize the explanatory gap. Why does activity feel like anything at all? Some dualists propose interactionist accounts or non-physical properties, while others frame the problem as a metaphysical caution. Concrete cases clarify the stakes. When a stroke abolishes speech and subjective report, materialism straightforwardly links tissue loss to functional loss, whereas dualism must explain how non-physical aspects are severed. Placebo effects and psychotherapy show that physical and psychological interventions both alter brain states and reported experience, favoring models that bridge levels. Artificial systems that mimic behavior also prompt questions about whether functional equivalence suffices for conscious experience. A productive middle path is methodological. Adopt ontological parsimony for practice, using physical models where they work while maintaining conceptual humility about ultimate metaphysics. Prioritize research that maps mechanisms, predicts interventions, and refines phenomenological categories. The debate remains philosophically deep, but need not paralyze empirical progress or ethical care. Next, consider the self as an illusion. Neurological cases, split-brain research, and dissociative phenomena show that what feels like one continuous self can fragment, suggesting that unity is constructed from multiple systems rather than handed to us intact. Context helps explain this. Evolution favored predictable agents. A unified self simplifies social coordination and internal planning. Yet the brain is a collection of specialized processes, perception, memory, valuation, motor control, that each contribute different outputs. The sense of self emerges when these outputs are stitched into a coherent narrative and reinforced through social feedback. Three mechanisms create this illusion. First, predictive binding. The brain integrates multimodal signals over time, producing a continuous model that reads as a single perspective. Second, narrative compression. Episodic traces are summarized into concise stories explaining actions and motives, giving continuity to disparate events. Third, social mirroring. Caregivers and peers label and repeat traits, stabilizing identity through external validation. Concrete examples illustrate this architecture. In split-brain research, separated hemispheres can endorse incompatible choices, revealing multiple controllers. In daily life, memory gaps or changing roles expose how narratives shape who we are. Developmental studies show that toddlers form identity through labeling and repeated social feedback, while adults revise their identity by rehearsing new roles and receiving confirming responses. A revealing paradox follows. The self's constructed nature makes it both fragile and supple. Fragile because disrupted integration can produce distress, supple because deliberate changes in routines, labels, and social signals can rewire what counts as me. Practical implications follow. Change identity using 3 low-friction steps. Practice small, repeatable behaviors that instantiate a new trait. Label those actions to form a narrative. Seek consistent social responses that reinforce the change. Finally, consider free will versus determinism. Our decisions arise from causal histories, yet the subjective sense of agency coordinates planning, social accountability, and learning. Even if free will is an illusion, this illusion is functionally indispensable. Philosophically, the debate asks whether actions are entirely caused by prior states or include uncaused choices. Neuroscience highlights causal precursors, readiness potentials, and predictive processes, while also showing that reflection and delayed action can change outcomes. The result is tension between causal completeness on one hand and lived agency on the other. 3 linked observations clarify practical stakes. First, causal chains explain mechanisms. Genes, development, and environment shape tendencies that bias choices. Second, metacognitive monitoring supplies the felt experience of control and the capacity to veto or revise impulses, supporting deliberation and learning even within causal constraints. Third, institutions, laws, norms, and feedback systems amplify agency by creating predictable contingencies, making deliberate planning effective. Concrete examples help. Pre-commitment devices, timed transfers, and account locks work regardless of metaphysical freedom because they change input conditions and subsequent behavior. In courts, assigning responsibility focuses less on metaphysics than on deterrence, rehabilitation, and social repair. Education and policy that strengthen deliberative opportunity, improve feedback, and reduce coercive constraints make it easier for agents to act in ways we value. A revealing practical synthesis follows. Debate about ultimate freedom need not paralyze policymaking. It is more useful to treat agency as a functional property to be supported rather than as a philosophical abstraction. This means designing environments that enhance transparency, provide clear and timely feedback, and create ample opportunity for reflection. Encourage practices like pre-commitment, establish clear incentives, and build restorative systems that operate on the assumption that people can learn, adapt, and improve over time. The nature of thought is instructive. Thought is not a single illuminating lantern, but more like a busy workshop, constantly active and evolving. It operates as a rapid, iterative recombination of stored patterns into provisional solutions that can be tested and refined. Context matters profoundly. The brain stores a wide array of practice routines, perceptual templates, motor sequences, and linguistic chunks, and it runs lightweight simulations that splice these pieces together efficiently. Evolution has favored this approach because it is fast and economical. Constructing nuanced ideas from cached components is far cheaper than computing everything from first principles. Cognitive science frames thought as the combination of retrieval plus transformation. Memory supplies the components, executive processes select and recombine them, and attention evaluates the outputs. Three key mechanisms explain how thinking unfolds. First, pattern retrieval provides a rich inventory of building blocks, analogies, schemas, and motor scripts that give immediate structure. Second, compositional recombination stitches these blocks into novel arrangements, enabling analogy, planning, and problem-solving. Third, metacognitive evaluation iterates rapidly. Inner speech, mental imagery, and quick tests prune weak assemblies and guide further recombination. Concrete examples illuminate this workshop model. A chess player scans familiar patterns, recombines moves into candidate lines, and mentally tests the likely outcomes. A poet blends metaphors from different domains until phrasing achieves coherence. A garage mechanic imagines a sequence of motions before even touching the tools. In each case, thought is economical. It recycles, recombines, and simulates just enough to act effectively. A revealing paradox emerges. Thought feels seamless and unitary, yet it is in fact a succession of discrete, testable constructions. This discreteness is an advantage because errors remain local and updates can be implemented quickly, though it also explains why thinking can feel effortful when the component pieces are weak or poorly organized. The practical implication is clear. Improve thinking by improving both the parts and the workshop. Build richer pattern libraries through varied practice. Externalize assemblies with notes or sketches to reduce memory load. And use rapid, falsifiable tests to prune ineffective recombinations. Practicing analogical transfer strengthens recombination skills over time, and better components plus faster recombination yield clearer, more reliable thought. Small experiments accelerate learning by revealing which assembly choices work best. The role of introspection is equally nuanced. Introspection is informative but fallible. While we can accurately report many of our mental states, we also routinely confabulate reasons and overlook unconscious drivers. Introspection involves turning attention inward to report thoughts, feelings, and motives. It provides crucial data for self-regulation, moral responsibility, and therapy. Yet it operates on limited inputs. The sensory and mnemonic traces available to conscious awareness represent only a subset of the processes shaping behavior. Cognitive science and neuroscience show that introspective access depends on which representations are broadcast into higher-order systems, and that reports can be reconstructed after the fact. Three mechanisms explain why introspection both helps and misleads. First, access limitation. Only some neural representations reach the workspace available for verbal report, leaving many fast procedural signals outside awareness. Second, post hoc construction. When asked why we acted, the mind often assembles plausible narratives from memory and contextual cues rather than retrieving a verbatim internal log, producing confident but inaccurate explanations. Third, metacognitive monitoring. Humans possess capacities to evaluate their own confidence and error rates, which can be trained and used to flag unreliable introspections. Concrete examples clarify practical applications. In therapy, naming emotions and mapping triggers improves regulation because labeling recruits descriptive and regulatory networks. In decision-making contexts, asking for predicted outcomes before acting reduces post hoc rationalization. Laboratory studies show that people commonly misattribute sources of mood, confusing weather with interpersonal causes, unless prompted to consider alternatives. A revealing paradox emerges. Introspection is essential for insight, yet simultaneously a source of error. Its reliability improves when the process is structured. Time-box introspection, collect external data, note confidence, and test hypotheses through small experiments.
Practice labeling sensations precisely, maintain brief observational notes, and actively seek disconfirming evidence over time. Pairing measured introspective reports with behavioral tests sharpens self-knowledge and reduces costly confabulation. Moral emotions and empathy provide another revealing fact. Observing another person's distress activates overlapping neural and autonomic responses in our own pain circuits. Empathy is rooted in shared physiological processing, not mere intellectual sympathy. Moral emotions, such as shame, guilt, indignation, and compassion, function as information channels that compress complex social facts into actionable signals. Guilt flags likely harm we have caused. Shame signals threats to social standing. Indignation highlights violations of norms. And compassion points to opportunities for repair. Evolution favored these signals because they coordinate reciprocal behavior and enforced cooperation in contexts where reputation mattered. 4 mechanisms explain how these emotions shape moral behavior. First, affect as signal. Visceral responses provide rapid priorities that guide attention and choice. Second, perspective taking. Empathic empathy simulates other states, adding granularity to raw affect and informing appropriate responses. Third, social enforcement. Indignation and shame operate as decentralized policing tools, broadcasting norms and deterring violations. Fourth, learning and calibration. Moral emotions update through feedback, praise, sanctions, and observed outcomes, allowing norms to evolve within groups. Concrete examples anchor these ideas. In small-scale societies, public shaming and ritual apology maintain cooperation by making deviations costly. In modern organizations, structured feedback and visible accountability systems channel moral emotions toward corrective action rather than escalation. Laboratory work links empathic concern with helping behavior, and longitudinal studies show that moral emotions predict long-term cooperation better than abstract moral reasoning alone. A revealing tension arises. The same mechanisms that enable social cohesion can also produce out-group hostility when empathy is deployed selectively. Practical implications follow. Cultivate broader perspective-taking to expand the circle of empathy. Design institutions that translate moral signals into constructive feedback, clear norms, predictable sanctions, and repair pathways. Train metacognitive checks to prevent moral emotions from hardening into reflexive condemnation. In short, moral emotions and empathy are approximate tools for social coordination. Fast, noisy, and improvable. Use them deliberately. Expand the people whose states you simulate. Make norms explicit, and convert affective alerts into structured opportunities for repair. Ethics and the human condition come into focus. Ethics functions as the social software that scales cooperation. Moral rules influence behavior faster than laws alone because they tap into emotions, reputation, and routine. Human life exists between scarcity and abundance, individuality and interdependence. Ethics emerges to solve coordination problems: who shares, who sacrifices, who punishes free riders. Evolution shaped proximate tools, empathy, guilt, and indignation that convert social facts into prioritized actions, allowing humans to navigate the complex terrain of social life. Culture then refines and composes these tools into explicit norms and institutions that stabilize large-scale cooperation. 3 mechanisms explain the dynamics of ethics. First, norm formation. Local practices that produce mutual benefits tend to spread through social learning and become moralized when sanctions and reputational consequences are attached. Second, moral emotion. Effective signals compress complex social information, prompting quick action and reinforcing memory. Compassion encourages helping behavior, while indignation highlights norm violations. Third, institutional scaffolding. Laws, markets, and rituals translate moral impulses into predictable incentives and corrective structures. These mechanisms allow cooperation to persist even under conditions of anonymity and large scale. Concrete tensions are unavoidable. Norms solve coordination problems, but they also inherently exclude. Moral emotions bind groups together, yet they can justify harshness toward outsiders. Institutions can either institutionalize justice or entrench injustice. Historical examples illustrate these dynamics. Communal sharing norms in small societies evolved to maintain cohesion, while bureaucratic rule systems in modern states show shifts in ethical emphasis as societies scale and technology advances. A practical stance follows. Treat ethics as a design challenge. First, make norms visible and enforceable with low-cost cues and reliable feedback. Second, widen the circle of empathy through practices that increase contact and perspective-taking. Third, institutionalize repair mechanisms by creating clear channels for accountability, restitution, and learning, preventing cycles of moral fury from calcifying into harm. Finally, cultivate habits, small rituals, public commitments, and transparent decision rules that align private action with collective standards. Ethics is neither fixed nor purely subjective. It is a living technology for living together. Norms and institutions should be designed consciously, tested for their effects, and iterated so that moral life scales with human complexity.
Meaning and the search for purpose intersect deeply with ethics and human well-being. A precise finding emerges from longitudinal studies. People who report a strong sense of purpose show measurably better health and longevity, demonstrating that meaning is not just philosophical, but a predictor of tangible outcomes. Meaning lives at the intersection of enduring projects and the stories that justify them. Biologically, humans respond strongly to immediate rewards, yet psychologically, we require extended reasons to invest effort over months and years. Purpose arises when short-term impulses are organized by narratives pointing toward a future self, and when social systems recognize and reinforce that direction. 4 mechanisms explain how durable meaning emerges. First, commitment structures convert transient desires into sustained action. Deadlines, memberships, and public promises make continued effort more likely. Second, narrative framing compresses messy experience into coherent plots. Understanding why you act in terms of a story you can retell anchors motivation. Third, ritualization and micro-habits translate lofty aims into repeatable cues that produce steady progress. Fourth, social validation provides external reinforcement. Recognition, role expectations, and reciprocal investment make a purpose socially plausible and personally sticky. Concrete examples clarify this logic. A teacher who frames daily grading as part of building future readers sustains effort better than one focused solely on immediate payoff. Volunteers who share progress in groups maintain engagement over time. Long-term research projects survive because methods, rituals, and peer norms preserve momentum across setbacks. A revealing paradox emerges. Pursuing meaning directly as a goal often undermines it. Meaning is best cultivated as a byproduct of repeated, socially embedded commitments. Practical steps follow. Choose modest, time-bounded projects you can repeat. Write short narratives linking actions to a future self.
Establish 2 micro-rituals, start and closure for each day's work, and share progress with a small accountability circle. Over months, these low-friction practices convert discrete actions into a durable sense of purpose that supports well-being and sustained contribution.
The aware universe presents one of the most striking scientific facts. It is procedural. Every empirical claim depends on observers registering outcomes, making awareness an operational constraint on theories of the universe. This perspective reframes a key question. Do facts about consciousness merely supervene on physical processes, or do they function as constraints that shape which physical descriptions are empirically adequate? In physics, measurement and information are not neutral. They determine which states are accessible and which predictions succeed. Awareness, treated as a capacity to register and report, becomes part of the data set that any complete account must accommodate. 3 linked observations clarify productive trajectories. First, observational constraint. Theories that ignore how information is gathered risk underspecifying which structures matter. Quantum measurement problems exemplify this principle. Observable outcomes depend on interactions that correlate systems with measuring apparatuses. Second, explanatory economy. Adding consciousness as a fundamental ingredient carries ontological cost. Strong panpsychism risks multiplying kinds of entities unless it produces distinct, testable predictions. Minimalist approaches treat functional and integrative criteria as empirically tractable proxies. Third, phenomenological data. Subjective reports and altered states provide structured variations that can be mapped to neural and systemic signatures, offering controlled axes for comparison. Concrete approaches follow. Treat consciousness as a target property defined by functional markers, integrated information, global broadcasting, or predictive coherence. Test whether extending physical models to include these markers improves predictive power. Compare systems, brains, and engineered networks along these axes, looking for divergences that require new principles. A revealing paradox emerges. Treating the universe as aware can serve either as a metaphysical flourish or as a strict research heuristic. Practically, use awareness as a constraint. Design experiments in which reportability and information flow are variables, and prefer hypotheses that maximize empirical leverage. This approach keeps inquiry scientific while respecting the reality that subjective data is essential for a complete account of reality. The collective mind. Humans don't store complete portraits of everyone they know. Instead, the brain stores compressed role patterns, friend, rival, mentor, that allow dozens of relationships to be tracked despite limited cognitive bandwidth. The social brain evolved to manage relationships because cooperation provides clear benefits. Rather than memorizing every single trait of every person, our neural systems compress repeated patterns into role-like templates and predictive rules. This compression allows for rapid inference, predicting what a neighbor expects, whether a colleague will reciprocate, and making decisions at a scale beyond what raw memory alone could handle. 4 key mechanisms explain how this works. Social cognition achieves scale first through compression. Category-like representations reduce complexity. Labels and stereotypes are imperfect but efficient indexes. Second is predictive modeling. The brain simulates likely reactions from a small set of inferred motives, which saves time in fast social exchanges. Third is reputation signaling. Gossip, ritual, and public acknowledgement act as distributed memory, broadcasting compressed summaries that coordinate expectations. Fourth is institutional scaffolding. Norms, roles, systems, markets, laws, and teams externalize social computations so individuals rely less on private inference. Concrete examples make this practical. Small communities use gossip to replace exhaustive surveillance, while modern platforms codify reputations through ratings and visible histories. Teams establish clear roles in rituals to minimize misunderstanding during high-pressure tasks. The trade-off, however, is fidelity. Compression reduces nuance and can crystallize bias. Practical implications follow. Improve social accuracy by widening your sample and making implicit patterns explicit. Seek disconfirming evidence about key people. Formalize expectations in teams through roles, checklists, public commitments, and design transparent reputation cues where trust is critical. At the societal level, institutions that surface reliable information, maintain clear records, and offer impartial arbitration reduce costly misprediction. In short, the social brain wins scale by compressing others into actionable patterns, guarding against error by exposing those patterns to testing, and building external scaffolds that preserve nuance while keeping coordination manageable. Theory of mind. A single glance can launch dozens of rapid mental models, predicting a stranger's next move, estimating long-term preferences, and placing them into cultural roles. Theory of mind is the set of tools that builds those models. Context matters. From infancy, humans begin attributing unseen mental states, desires, beliefs, and intentions. By around age 4, children pass false belief tasks, demonstrating explicit perspective-taking. Neuroscience locates key operations in networks that simulate others' viewpoints and compare predictions with outcomes. Evolution favored these systems because anticipating others' behavior improves cooperation, deception detection, and coordination. 3 mechanisms explain how theory of mind operates in practice. First is simulation. We reuse our own decision models to imagine what another person would do in the same situation. Second is hierarchical reasoning. We compute first-order beliefs, like she wants X, and then second-order beliefs, like she thinks I want Y, enabling negotiation and strategy. Third is calibration through feedback. Social responses update our models, and repeated interactions refine templates into reliable predictions. Examples demonstrate both power and limits. In conversation, small cues such as eye contact and timing signal immediate intent. In politics, narratives and identity help predict longer-term positions. Errors are systematic. Projection leads to the spotlight effect and the curse of knowledge, while limited samples produce stereotyping. Second-order mistakes can create tragic miscoordination when parties misread motives. A revealing paradox emerges. Accurate social prediction requires both imaginative simulation and disciplined testing. Yet everyday interactions often privilege speed over verification. Practical steps reduce error. Slow down to test assumptions. Ask one clarifying question before acting. Treat confident judgments as provisional, and collect behavioral evidence rather than relying on plausible stories. In groups, create shared norms and transparent signals to reduce costly inference. Theory of mind is not mystical insight. It is a layered competence that can be sharpened through deliberate practice, structured feedback, and clearer communication. Practicing these habits improves social outcomes over time. Conformity and obedience. Classic laboratory studies show that roughly 1/3 of participants followed orders to administer what they believed were harmful shocks to another person, demonstrating how authority cues can override personal judgment. Conformity and obedience are complementary social solutions. Conformity aligns individuals with local norms, allowing coordination to happen swiftly, while obedience aligns actions to hierarchical commands, allowing complex tasks to scale. The underlying mechanisms are clear. Social proof and normative pressure make people adopt majority behaviors to gain approval and reduce risk. Authority heuristics trigger deference when a source appears credentialed. Situational cues, uniforms, institutional settings, and time pressure amplify both tendencies. Cognitive load and ambiguity increase reliance on social signals, while diffusion of responsibility reduces perceived personal culpability. Empirical examples clarify the dynamics. Ash's line experiments show that private disagreement yields public conformity under majority pressure. Milgram's obedience studies reveal how incremental requests and an experimenter's presence shift responsibility outward. Field observations add nuance. Workplaces, militaries, and bureaucracies harness obedience for efficiency, but can perpetuate harmful practices when checks are absent. A paradox emerges. The same mechanisms that make groups functional also enable error and wrongdoing. Conformity stabilizes norms, but can fossilize bad practices. Obedience secures coordination, but can erode moral responsibility. Practical implications focus on institutional design and personal habits. Build checks, independent audits, rotating leadership, and clear reporting channels. Normalize constructive dissent with devil's advocate roles and anonymous feedback. Train people to recognize authority cues and use accountability scripts. Name the decision, state the authority claim, and request verification. Create brief pauses at critical junctions to surface alternatives. In daily life, practice two habits. Ask, what would an outside observer see? And invite one disconfirming perspective before major choices. Small, repeatable checks preserve coordination while reducing the risk of harmful conformity and blind obedience. Systems should be designed to encourage thoughtful dissent. Tribalism and group identity. Even a single arbitrary label can generate preferential treatment within minutes, showing that tribalism is a fast social heuristic, not a slow moral choice. Tribalism begins as a cognitive shortcut. In complex social environments, humans compress information into categories: friend or foe, ally or outsider, so decisions require less evidence and less time. Evolution favored this because quick alignment with the group improved coordination and survival. Modern life, however, multiplies group labels and lowers their cost, turning an adaptive shortcut into a social lens that distorts judgment. Four mechanisms explain how tribalism operates and escalates. First is social categorization, which creates in-group bias. Once labeled, people overweight positive evidence for insiders and negative evidence for outsiders. Second is signaling and ritual, which bind members together, making loyalty visible and costly to fake. Third is norm enforcement and moralization, which convert practical cooperation into moral duty, punishing deviation and amplifying cohesion. Fourth is identity fusion. Group membership becomes part of the self-concept, so threats to the group feel like threats to the individual and justify extreme defense. Concrete examples clarify the dynamics. Sports rivalries can harmlessly channel identity, while political media ecosystems turn policy disagreements into moral warfare. Corporations can foster helpful loyalty, but when unchecked, this can suppress whistleblowing and prevent people from speaking up against wrongdoing. Online platforms amplify selective exposure and intensify signaling, accelerating polarization. A revealing paradox emerges. Tribal structures enable trust and large-scale cooperation, yet they also magnify conflict when group boundaries align with competition for resources or status. Practical responses, therefore, aim to preserve coordination while reducing destructive alignment. Design interventions with care. Create cross-cutting identities, project teams, and mixed interest groups. Make norms explicit and incentivize seeking disconfirming evidence. Institutionalize transparent feedback and accountability.
Cultivate routine perspective-taking exercises that reveal overlapping interests. In daily practice, limit single-access identities, rotate roles, seek at least 3 disconfirming sources before endorsing a claim, and build low-cost rituals that connect across groups. Small structural changes can redirect the benefits of tribalism toward resilience rather than rivalry.
The psychology of influence. People often change behavior more in response to perceived consensus than to persuasive facts. Social cues shortcut deliberation because they compress complex trust into simple signals. Influence exploits heuristics. Evolution and culture favor shortcuts that allow us to infer reliability quickly. If many people do X or a credible source endorses Y, accepting that as truth is a low-cost bet. Psychology identifies reliable levers: social proof, follow the majority; reciprocity, return favors; authority, defer to experts; scarcity, value limited items; commitment and consistency, honor prior statements; and liking, comply with those we like. These levers operate without deep reasoning, making influence fast and scalable. Mechanisms interact. Social proof and authority convert ambiguity into action. Commitment turns small initial acts into larger behaviors. Scarcity increases perceived urgency and reduces testing. Classic experiments and fieldwork illustrate this. Ash's conformity studies, Milgram's obedience paradigms, and Cialdini's applied research show these levers reliably move groups even when arguments fail. A paradox follows. Efficient cues increase coordination and trust, but they also enable manipulation. The same shortcut that helps you quickly choose a vaccine during an outbreak can be exploited to sell worthless products or polarize publics. Practical ethical guidance splits into 2 tracks. To influence responsibly, make cues truthful, test interventions, obtain informed consent, and prioritize reversible nudges. To resist undue influence, slow decisions, check base rates, require external verification for urgent claims, and expose hidden incentives. Use commitment carefully. Pre-commit to principles rather than outcomes, and diversify trusted sources. In short, the psychology of influence trades argumentative depth for signal speed. Design and consume influence deliberately. Use honest cues to guide action. And build simple defenses through delay, verification, and diverse sampling to maintain autonomy. Mass behavior and collective emotion. Groups often feel louder than the sum of their members. When emotion spreads through a network, it amplifies signal, shortens deliberation, and converts private unease into public action. Collective emotion is not merely many people feeling the same thing. It is a process where affect functions as fast information. A shout, image, or metric triggers neighbors who react in turn. The structure of the network, tight clusters, influential hubs, and bridging ties determines whether that initial spark becomes a local ripple or a global wave. Media and institutions translate that wave into material effects by coordinating resources, changing incentives, or signaling legitimacy. 4 mechanisms explain predictable dynamics. First, emotional contagion. Mirrored expressions and rapid sharing move affect before facts are processed. Second, threshold signaling. Individuals act when perceived participation crosses personal thresholds, producing sudden cascades. Third, feedback amplification. Visible reactions, trends, and headlines validate and accelerate the emotion. Fourth, institutional coupling. Markets, platforms, and organizations convert collective feeling into tangible outcomes, such as purchases, protests, or policy shifts. Concrete examples are familiar. Panic buying emerges when visible scarcity signals meet low personal thresholds. Viral outrage can topple reputations when hubs amplify accusations. Coordinated enthusiasm drives crowdfunding campaigns and cultural hits. The risks include systematic error, false alarms, mob punishment, and erosion of deliberative norms. Practical responses emphasize measurement and calibrated friction. Monitor multiple signals and behavioral metrics, not just sentiment. Create predictable delays for high-impact actions. Diversify trusted messengers to reduce hub-driven spikes. And design low-cost verification steps before mass coordination. Public timelines and transparent criteria help. Institutions should expose incentives and allow graceful reversals to prevent escalation. In short, collective emotion is an informational amplifier, powerful and efficient for coordination, yet prone to runaway error. Systems should surface reliable data, add modest buffers, and preserve avenues for correction so public feeling can guide action without hijacking it. Culture as a mirror of mind. Culture mirrors mind by externalizing recurring mental operations into public patterns that individuals can reuse. Human minds face limits: finite attention, fallible memory, and variable experience. Culture compresses these limits into shared artifacts, myths, rituals, tools, and stories that encode heuristics for interpreting the world. In this sense, culture is a toolbox built from repeated mental successes. Its forms are not arbitrary ornaments, but distilled solutions. Calendars solve seasonal prediction. Etiquette reduces social friction. And jokes mark shared categories. 3 mechanisms explain culture's mirror function. First, externalization. Minds offload cognitive work into public symbols and routines, allowing complex tasks to survive across individuals and generations. Second, stabilization. Repeated practice and social reinforcement turn provisional techniques into stable traditions that newcomers adopt without re-deriving them. Third, amplification. Institutions and media scale local solutions into widespread norms that feed back into mental habits, reshaping attention and expectation. Evidence appears in cross-cultural regularities and cultural evolution studies. Certain moral motifs and kinship rules recur because they solve predictable coordination problems. Technological innovations spread when they reduce cognitive or material cost. Everyday examples illustrate the concept. A recipe encodes timing and ratios so a novice can reproduce a dish. A ceremonial greeting coordinates status cues so interactions proceed without costly negotiation. A revealing paradox follows. Culture preserves successful mental shortcuts, but also ossifies biases. The practical takeaway is design-minded stewardship. Treat cultural forms as tools to be evaluated. When a tradition impairs learning or excludes, adjust its signals and incentives. When a practice promotes shared understanding, promote transmission through clear cues and reproducible steps. Curate cultural tools deliberately so public life supplies clearer mental models for collective flourishing and resilience. Memes and shared myths. A single catchy image or phrase can rewire group behavior faster than a long argument because memes compress meaning into signals that travel with low cognitive cost. Memes and shared myths are cultural replicators, units of information, stories, symbols, or rituals that propagate because they solve coordination problems, signal identity, or structure attention. They survive when transmission is easy, mimetic fidelity is high, they resonate with existing emotional or cognitive frameworks like a fear of loss, humor, or desire for status, get amplified and shared more often. The third is scaffolding. Memes that attach to rituals, Institutions or incentives become self-sustaining because repeated practice and meaningful payoffs keep them alive well beyond their initial novelty. Concrete examples make this clearer. Urban legends propagate because they fit familiar storytelling templates and trigger cautionary responses. Brand slogans become shared myths when they are embedded in the rituals of consumption and repeated constantly. Political myths consolidate support when they align with identity cues and receive reinforcement through institutions. Online culture accelerates the selection of memes, favoring content that replicates rapidly, is emotionally charged, and grabs attention, sometimes at the expense of nuance or accuracy. Here lies a revealing paradox. While memes can increase coordination and shared understanding, they also crystallize error. A myth that is useful for simplifying decision-making can ossify into rigid dogma. The practical takeaway is to curate memes deliberately. Favor templates that encourage testing, verifiable claims, and transparent sources. Attach these myths to constructive rituals, structured debate routines, and civic practices, while reducing the spread of brittle formats, anonymous outrage, and unchecked virality. Media literacy should emphasize tracing sources and mapping motives. In short, memes are powerful cultural tools, efficient for coordination, yet potentially dangerous when left unexamined. The goal is to shape the formats and incentives that select for accuracy and repair, not just for rapid spread. Technology now makes a global brain possible. Digital networks have turned isolated individual judgments into coordinated collective action. Today, a few platforms guide the attention of billions of people daily, effectively wiring human minds into a single, distributed problem-solving system and amplifier. The term global brain is not just metaphorical. It reflects how technology provides infrastructure for minds to share memory, test hypotheses, and coordinate on a planetary scale. Historically, institutions externalized cognition through libraries, markets, and courts. Modern technology accelerates this process. Databases act as extended memory. Algorithms function as shared heuristics, and low-latency messaging enables rapid coordination. Four core mechanisms drive this effect. First, attention markets allocate limited cognitive bandwidth, meaning what we see and think about is shaped by ranking algorithms and economic incentives. Second, shared memory through search, archives, and collaborative platforms allows many minds to access the same representations and iterate on them together. Third, low-latency feedback closes loops. Rapid signals amplify successful patterns and suppress less effective ones, often before careful deliberation can intervene. Fourth, governance scaffolds determine which patterns are allowed to scale. Protocols, moderation, and economic rules shape the emergent behavior of these networks. Concrete examples illustrate the trade-offs. Collective projects like open-source software and collaborative knowledge bases solve problems that single experts cannot handle alone. On the other hand, virality can propagate errors and polarize attention when signaling overrides verification. The same fast feedback loops that enable emergency coordination can also produce attention cascades that outpace correction. The design implications are clear. Build modular, transparent attention architectures, diversify hubs to avoid single points of failure, embed verification into feedback loops, and create slower, careful pathways for high-risk decisions. Institutionalize visible incentives so the benefits of the global brain are reproduced rather than exploited. In short, technology makes a global mind possible, powerful, fragile, and dependent on design. Treat the global brain as an engineered ecology. Tune its incentives, expose its signals, and protect its diversity so that collective intelligence grows resilient rather than runaway. The future of human consciousness is already being shaped deliberately. Deep brain stimulation, psychedelics, and brain-computer interfaces alter experience in fundamental ways, which means the future of consciousness will be a socially regulated, engineered landscape, not some inevitable revelation. Consciousness changes when the inputs change. Tools that expand sensory bandwidth, mediate attention, or modify memory traces alter the raw data the brain uses to model the world. Augmentation takes multiple forms. Pharmacological tuning shifts effective set points. Interfaces feed external memory or perceptual streams into cortical processes, and social platforms shape which counts as salient. Each intervention reshapes the predictive models that generate subjective experience. Four dynamics will determine the nature of emergent consciousness. First, affordance selection. Technologies privilege certain modes of experience, like constant rapid feeds versus slower reflective depth, favoring minds adapted to those modes. Second, distributed embodiment. Cognition blurs boundaries, as extended memory, shared attention, and collaborative problem spaces create hybrid conscious systems. Third, evolutionary filtering. Social and economic incentives select attention architectures that succeed in current marketplaces, which may not always maximize flourishing or well-being. Fourth, governance and norming. Ethical frameworks, regulation, and shared social practices determine which augmentations become legitimate and how risks are mitigated. Concrete near-term examples are already visible. Restorative brain-computer interfaces that restore speech to paralyzed patients will normalize neural interfaces. Designs in the attention economy that reward quick reactivity risk increasing shallow processing unless countermeasures exist. Sanctioned therapeutic uses of psychedelics may expand culturally accepted models of meaning and emotion. A revealing paradox arises here. Expanding conscious capacity can simultaneously increase freedom and narrow form. To steer favorable outcomes, we should prioritize designs that preserve epistemic diversity, require transparent feedback loops, and embed reversible low-risk pathways for experimentation. Institutions should monitor effects on autonomy and social cohesion. Ultimately, the future of consciousness will be shaped both by technology and by civic choice. The things we build, regulate, and allow to flourish will determine what it feels like to be human in the decades ahead.